great to have you back as we are continuing our studies of the Greek language found in the New Testament. We've made it through 3 chapters now. I hope you're doing well. Take your time. You don't have to rush through this. You have now studied the rules of accent, and you've also been exposed to the verbs and the present active indicative that we find in the first set of vocabulary words in chapter 3. We're moving now to chapter 4, and in this particular chapter we are introduced to Greek nouns. So verbs and nouns, of course, are the fundamental elements that are necessary to make a sentence, and so you'll find in the exercises as we get to them that there's actually complete sentences here that you'll be able to start playing around with. Obviously, we're still at a very rudimentary level, but nevertheless, this is where we began, and hopefully you're finding this enjoyable. One of the things that is sometimes new to English-speaking students as they come to this chapter is the idea of a declension. Now, if you've studied other foreign languages, then this probably won't be a new idea to you, but if Greek is really your first exposure to languages that use declension, this might seem like an unexpected idea. So let me just try to explain it, and then you should read the chapter, of course, and hopefully between my explanation and the chapter it'll come to make a little bit of sense. A declension really is simply a way of describing how a noun is used in a sentence. In English, we have simply 2 uses, basically, the objective and the subjective, and so typically you don't hear the word declension used in connection with English nouns. The subjective use of the noun would be typically when it's used as the subject in a sentence. For example, I might say, a man studies Greek. The word man there, the noun, is of course in the subjective case because it stands in the position of being the subject of the sentence. If I were to say, on the other hand, that Greek is being studied by a man, then we have the word man being used as the object of a preposition, the preposition by a man. And in that case, we call that the objective case. And that's really all there is in English. The way that we put nouns in various structures or contexts in a sentence is basically through the use of verbs, prepositions, and other words that basically put the noun in some kind of grammatical setting. Now, when it comes to Greek, we find that there's more than just those 2. In fact, Greek, the New Testament Greek, uses 5 different cases, and these cases represent part of what's called the declension of the noun. The cases are the nominative, which stands for the noun being used in the sense of the subject, the genitive, which typically has to do with possession. If I say something is owned by a man, or a man's hammer, for example, the word man with apostrophe s there in English would be the genitive case in Greek. The dative case, I throw a ball to a man. The word to, or the phrase to a man there, would be an indirect object. The accusative case, which is the case of direct object, I throw a man into the next ballpark, then the man in that case would be the direct object of the verb to throw. And finally, the vocative case, in which we're simply addressing someone. Man, wake up. The word man there would be in the vocative. So you can see there's 5 different cases, and those are the terms that are used. If you happen to have studied Latin somewhere along the way, you'll recognize those cases. You may also be wondering if there's an ablative case, and there is not in New Testament Greek. And so if you're familiar with that jargon, then you'll know that the 5 cases that are shown there, you'll find them somewhat familiar to you, and yet the ablative doesn't show up. Something else we need to notice about nouns is that in Greek, nouns have gender, number, and case. We've talked about the case already. The gender is either masculine or feminine or neuter. Again, in English, you don't have gender in that sense, but many languages do. Obviously, French has gender, Italian has gender, Greek has gender, and so each noun that you learn is going to have, along with the actual word and its meaning and its spelling, you'll need to learn the gender. Now, the way that you recognize the gender as you encounter it in the vocabulary list is you'll notice that the word is provided, and immediately afterward you have a little letter typically, or maybe a two-letter word. So for example, if you're looking at the vocabulary list for this particular lesson, you'll notice that adelphos is a word in the vocabulary list. Adelphos, which means brother. And if you look immediately after that word adelphos, you'll see that there's the letter ho, the omicron, with a rough breather. That omicron with the rough breather is actually the definite article. We haven't studied articles yet. It would be translated the. We haven't had those yet, but at this point, the only purpose that that letter serves is to tell you that the noun is in the masculine. If instead the word that followed the noun were the word to, T-O, or tau omicron, then it would tell you that it is neuter. And if, although we don't have this in this particular chapter, but if it were the word he, which would be the eta with a rough breather on top, that would tell you it's feminine because that's the feminine article. So that's the only purpose that those articles are serving in this chapter, but it is a way of noting that the gender of the noun is being communicated to you in that way. So we have gender, we have number, obviously it can be singular or plural, and we have case, and we've already talked about the case. The other thing you want to notice, of course, with these nouns is that the retentive rule of noun accent applies. And just to remind you, the retentive rule is the idea that whatever location you find ordinarily for the accent in the nominative singular is where the accent wants to remain as you work your way through the other words that show up in the declension. So we'll talk about that in some greater detail as we go along, but just make a note of that, and I will be trying to highlight that for you as we proceed. You'll notice also that in Greek the word order is rather fluid, much more fluid than in English. That tends to be the case of inflected languages where the setting of the word is determined by the ending that's attached to the word. So you can tell the sense in which a word is being used in a sentence by noticing the ending rather than by paying specific attention to where it shows up in terms of the word order. And so the word order in Greek is quite fluid. That actually is an important thing to notice because when you're reading the New Testament, sometimes subtle messages can be sent to you in a sense. Subtle emphases in the sentence are going to be present based on the word order. But if you notice the word order, then you're going to find that some sense of what the sentence is communicating is available to you in that way. So that's a little bit of an introductory comment. Let's go ahead and take a look at this chapter. Well, let's start off by taking a look at the vocabulary list. I'm on page 23 if you'd like to follow along. We have these new words. These are nouns, of course, that are being given to us. We've had an introduction to verbs, and now we're going to be adding some nouns, and that'll give us the ability to form some basic sentences, which is going to be enjoyable. But anyway, let's take a look at these. The first of these words is the word adelphos. The word adelphos right there. Adelphos, accented on the last syllable, means a brother. You, of course, are familiar with this. You know the city Philadelphia, which literally means city of brotherly love or love of a brother. Adelphos is probably most famous for that, but it shows up in other cognates as well. You'll notice that when we think about the rules of accent, we're going to remember that the retentive rule applies, meaning that the location of the accent in the nominative singular, which is what we are finding here in the vocabulary list, is where the accent wants to remain as long as it possibly can do so. We'll illustrate what that means as we go along, but for now, just make a note of this. Adelphos, it's masculine. The little article there indicates that it means a brother. Next word, anthropos. Anthropos. You, of course, know words in the English language that use this root. Anthropology, philanthropic, and other words. All are based on this Greek word, which means man. I might mention to you that in Greek there are two words for man. There's anthropos, which is the word man, meaning more the sense of man as in human, humankind or mankind. The word aner, that we're going to get quite a bit later in the book, actually means man as in male. And so this word is a little bit more generic, really stands more for the notion of man as humanity. Next word we have here is apostolos. Apostolos. This means an apostle. Of course, our English word apostle really comes direct from this word. Literally, it's apo, from, which is a preposition, and then from the Greek word stello, to send, literally means to send from. We haven't had prepositions yet, but when we get there, we'll see how this comes together. But for now, you just want to learn this word, apostolos. I think you're aware in the New Testament, the word apostolos typically applies to that narrow band of disciples who were attached to Jesus and were commissioned by him. So the word apostolos, of course, implies being sent with some sort of commission, some sort of authority, and is thus distinguished from the word disciple, the word mathetes that we're going to get later, which simply means a learner or somebody under a discipline. The word apostolos was actually used in the ancient Greek world as a military term, and it applied first of all to a fleet of ships and then to the commander of the fleet, who actually was commissioned to carry on a military expedition with a certain degree of authority. And it's interesting, of course, when we come to the New Testament, that we find it's actually a military term that is picked up and applied to those who are the followers and eventually the emissaries of Christ himself. Next we have the word doulos. Doulos. This word means a slave. It's distinguished from other words in the New Testament which mean more the notion of a servant. A slave is actually the lowest rung of the social ladder, and so this word is sometimes used in that connection. Sometimes it's used, of course, by somebody like the Apostle Paul. The book of Romans, for example, starts off Paulos doulos Christou Jesu. Paul, a slave of Jesus Christ, and he uses the most humble form of the notion of being a servant to describe his status. Notice that it's accented with a circumflex on the penult, because, of course, pursuant to the rules of accent, if the last syllable is short, then a long accented penult must have the circumflex. We have a similar application of the rules here, doron, which means a gift. It's neuter, by the way. Notice that the neuter article here tells us that it's neuter. This is similar, or at least connected to the English name. You may know the name Dorothy, literally Dorotheu, Doron Theu, Dorothy, gift of God. And of course, this word is the root behind that name. Again, notice that it has the circumflex on the penult, because a short ultima requires that a long accented penult have the circumflex. Next we have thanatos. Thanatos. Maybe you know the famous poem that was written once, some years back, by a 17-year-old genius entitled Thanatopsis. Thanatopsis, a view of death, comes from, of course, this Greek word thanatos, which means death, accented on the antepenult. Next we have the word hieron. Hieron. Notice, by the way, that here this is not a diphthong. The two vowels that come together at this point, if the epsilon is first, don't form a diphthong. They are two independent syllables. And so actually this is a three-syllable word, hieron. It's accented on the ultima. It means a temple. The next word is the word kai. Very common, of course, conjunction. It simply means the word, it means and. Next we have logos. Logos, masculine noun, very common. You've obviously heard this word, I'm sure. There's a major Christian publishing company that's called Logos, and the word is otherwise used rather commonly in various contexts. It means word, but it had a rich heritage in the philosophy of the Greeks, going clear back to the pre-Socratics. Heraclitus is the first one who really gets mileage out of it, and for him it stands for a notion of a coherency principle that lies at the heart of all of reality. That tends to be the way that the word continued to be used. Aristotle, of course, in his philosophy has ethos, logos, and pathos, those three aspects of communication, logos standing for reason. As we go forward, we find the mystery religions in Greek culture, we find the Stoics, Philo, the Greek or the Jewish philosopher in Alexandria, 1st century A.D., all use this word rather commonly to stand for a rational principle of coherence in the universe. When the Gospel of John begins, en arche ein ho logos, John is, of course, announcing to the Greek world that this which they have been concerned with for so many centuries is, in fact, the one who came to earth and was the centerpiece of human history and of human rationality, the Logos of God that became flesh. And so the word takes on rich significance, of course, in the New Testament, especially in John's writings. Nomos is a word that means law. We have a variety of words in the English language that use that root. For example, autonomous, autonomy, self-law, that sort of idea. In other words, you can probably think of. The next word we have is the word oikos. Oikos, notice that it has a circumflex on the penult. Under the rules of accent, that's required if the penult is accented. And so these two words together, house and law, are the root of the word that you know as the word economy. Econ, nomos, house law. When Adam Smith made that term famous, he, of course, was basing it on a Christian principle, really, that we have a stewardship. We are over a house, but we are bound to run this house based on the house law that was established by its owner, namely God. So oikonomos, economy, is based on that particular philosophy, really. Huios means son. So this is the word that is used in the New Testament, of course, commonly with respect to Christ. Huios, to theus, son of God, and otherwise used quite commonly as well. All right, working through some of the discussion here that Machen provides, there are 3 declensions in Greek. The declensions don't change the meaning of the words, but they do change the spelling. And Machen notes here that he decided to proceed with what may seem a little surprising, the second declension, before doing the first declension, just because the second declension is a little bit easier. So in the next chapter, we'll be looking at the first declension, which also is not that difficult, but at least this lets us wade into the shallow end of the pool a little bit more. Notice that he says in paragraph 26, there is no indefinite article. The indefinite article, as you know, is the word a, the letter A. So I talk about a man, a boat, a tree. Indefinite. In Greek, there is no such article. There is a definite article. I can speak about the boat, the tree, etc. But sometimes to do an English translation, I need to supply that indefinite article. There's a subtle difference between the way the Greek language uses the article and the way the English language uses the article. It's a little too subtle for us to be concerned with right now, but if you continue in your Greek studies beyond what we're going to be doing here in Machen, you'll eventually come across that. The article usually emphasizes identity. The anthropos construction, that is the construction without the article, emphasizes quality. But for now, we're just going to more or less translate it the same way we would do in normal English renderings. The noun in Greek, as you know, has gender, number, and case. We know what the case is. That's the spellings associated with the declension. The number has to do with whether it's singular or plural. The gender, masculine, feminine, or neuter. And he notes that here. Obviously, in English, we don't use the masculine and feminine so much. Most nouns are neuter, unless they're rather specifically tied with either the masculine or feminine sense. But Greek and many other languages, including languages like Italian, French, Latin, and so on, do have a distinction between masculine and feminine. The gender of the nouns, he notes, must be learned by observation. It's not possible to simply predict that the nouns are going to be masculine or feminine in any of the declensions. Most nouns in the second declension are masculine. Most nouns in the first declension are feminine. There are some neuter nouns in either one, but you need to be aware of the fact that for the most part, you just have to learn these nouns individually as they come up. He says that the gender is indicated in the vocabulary by the article that's going to be placed right after the noun. And so when you look at the vocabulary list, you just want to notice if it has an omicron, then it's going to be masculine. If it has an eta, it's going to be feminine. If it has the tau omicron, then it's the neuter gender. There are both singular and plural, as would be the case in virtually every language. The 5 cases noted here: the nominative, typically associated with the subject of the sentence; the genitive, associated with possession; the dative, usually associated with indirect object; the accusative with direct object; and the vocative with direct address. We'll, of course, say more about these as we go along, but you just make note of those 5 declensions at this point. He now gives you the declension of the word anthropos, and this is quite important to master. Notice that we have these 5 cases: the nominative, genitive, dative, accusative, and vocative. We have the singular and we have the plural. So when you do the permutation of that, you wind up with basically 10 different spellings of the word anthropos. Now, of course, the vocative is identical in either one, so he doesn't reproduce it over here, but you have 10 altogether in this chart. Anthropos is the nominative singular. This is the form that you're going to find in the vocabulary list. If we're going to say of a man, something belongs to a man, you see that idea, then it becomes anthropou. But notice the long ultima requires that the position of the accents shift from the antepenult to the penult. You'll recall from the rules of accent that if a word has a long ultima, it cannot be accented on the antepenult, and so in effect it drags the accent down like a magnet to the penult, and it's going to stay there as long as the ultimate is long. So we have a similar accent here with anthropo. Anthropo, the indirect object, to or for a man, again accented on the penult. But now, when we come to the accusative, notice that the ultima is short, anthropon, and so the accent pops back to where we found it, pursuant to the retentive rule, wanting to retain its original position in the word unless the ending requires otherwise. Anthropa, the vocative, similarly is a situation where we have a short ultima, and on the basis of that, the accent is going to go back to where we found it. Over on the plural side, the nominative plural is anthropoi, and that, by the way, is also the vocative plural. So anthropoi, accented on the antepenult because the ultima is short. Anthropon is the genitive plural, and of course now we see the accent moves to the penult. Anthropos, it stays here. The omicron iota is not the last, are not the last 2 letters of the word. They're followed by a sigma, and so ois there is long. And then finally anthropous, again, leaves the accent on the penult. Now these are the endings. You're going to be finding that as you learn other words in the second declension, these are the same endings, you see, so the endings are simply going to be mixed and matched, applied to the word as necessary to make the sense out of the sentence that you're looking at. He notes here the student should observe carefully how the principles of accent apply, and I've attempted to explain that to you, but make sure you understand it, make sure you get it, because that is a fairly important part of understanding how the declension is going to manipulate and affect the accents. Notice that he says the stem of a noun is that part of the noun which remains constant as various endings are added. So as we've seen above, the stem of anthropos is anthropo, and the other endings are attached to it, such as the sigma right here. He notes here, as a practical matter, it's more convenient to simply learn the endings as os, u, own, and so on, and I think that's probably the safest way to do it. So as you're learning these words, you should think of the anthropos, you should think of the omicron sigma as the ending over here, you should think of the omicron iota as the ending that's being attached to the stem, and that's how you'll form the various parts of the declension. The next page he explains what I've also mentioned to you, so I won't read this, just go through this rapidly, but you know the nominative is used with respect to the subject. The accusative is going to be related to direct objects, so blepo logon means I see a word, and word there is in the accusative, the direct object of the verb blepo. The genitive expresses possession. The dative has to do with indirect objects, so lego, logon, apostolos, I say a word, there's the direct object, to apostles, this is the dative plural, the indirect object of the action of the verb. And then finally the vocative is the case of direct address. If I'm going to address someone specifically, adelpha, blepomen, brother, we see, you see would be the idea there. He says, learn the declension of logos, a word, and of doulos, a servant, which are provided to you at paragraph 557 in the back of the book. The only thing you need to bear in mind is simply it's going to illustrate the way that the rules of accent apply. And so as you look at those in the back of the book, you won't find any surprises except that the accent wants to remain where you find it, but that it will be affected by the length of the ultima. So take a look at that in paragraph 557, but I think you'll find that it is not too difficult to predict how the accents work there. The declension of huios, a son, however, requires a little bit of additional comment. So we have huios accented on the ultima right there, and then notice huiou gives rise to a circumflex. Now, we would not have predicted necessarily that a circumflex would show up at this point. There's no rule of accent that would require that. But we notice that here we have the circumflex in the genitive and dative. And we notice it's the same thing over here, the genitive and dative on the plural side as well. Then in the accusative, it goes back to an acute. And in the vocative, it remains an acute. And over here in the accusative plural, it remains acute as it does in the nominative plural. So the thing that we notice is that in the genitive and dative of both numbers, for some reason or other, we find that the accent, which was an acute, becomes a circumflex. And the explanation for that is provided for us on the next page at paragraph 40. And paragraph 40 is one of those paragraphs that we will refer back to a fair number of times, so you might just want to make a note of that. Sometimes it's actually called Rule 40, but it's really related to this paragraph 40. And the explanation is as follows. Here the rule of noun accent decrees that the accent must be in the ultima, but because it was there in the nominative singular, but what accent shall it be? The general rules of accent would say simply that the accent would remain on the ultima, but the special rule that applies is mentioned by Machen at this point is as follows. In the second declension, when the ultima is accented at all, it has the circumflex in the genitive and dative of both numbers, elsewhere the acute. So that's just a rule. It's a little bit out of the blue, I know, but believe me, it won't be the last time we run into rules that seem to be a little bit out of the blue. So just make a note of that. In the second declension, and I'll add, by the way, we'll learn this is also true of the first declension, but in the second declension, when the ultima is accented at all, it has the circumflex in the genitive and dative of both numbers, elsewhere the acute. If we drop down to paragraph 41, we'll notice the word doron. This is a neuter noun, and he mentions it to you separately now, and I'll just go through it once again to illustrate how the rules of accent are going to be affected. Here we have doron, which is, of course, the nominative singular, but notice in the genitive it becomes doru. The omicron upsilon is long, and remember lilac pen, last is long, acute on the penult. Similarly here, doro, acute on the penult, but then doron, when we come to the accusative, returns to a circumflex because now the last syllable is short. Dora is going to remain a circumflex. The alpha here could be long or short, but as he's going to note down here below in the neuter nouns in the second declension, it's always short. Doron, long ultima, changes back to a acute. Dorois, same deal here, and then dora, the alpha is short, so it goes back to a circumflex. And notice What he says here at paragraph 42, it'll be observed that doron is a neuter noun in all neuter nouns of all declensions, the vocative and accusative. Okay, so notice that. The vocative here and the accusative. The vocative and accusative of both numbers are like the nominative, and the nominative, vocative, and accusative plural always end in a short alpha. And so that's the thing to bear in mind, that when you're dealing with words that are in this particular declension, second declension, that it's going to be a short alpha, and that's why we find the circumflex there. Notice at paragraph 43, he talks about order of words. He says the normal order of the sentence in Greek is like that of English, starting with a subject, a verb, and an object. He continues that there may be a tendency, as in Latin, to put the verb at the end, but the point is the Greek can vary the order for purposes of emphasis in a manner that is much more fluid than you would find in English. And the way that you make sense out of the sentence, therefore, is by keeping an eye on the endings, because the endings tell you the grammatical setting of the word that is being used. So notice he has apostolos lege logon. An apostle says a word, but then notice lege, he says, apostolos, an apostle, logon, a word. Well, again, it's the same sentence and it means the same thing, but the word order has been shifted around, and sometimes that'll happen for purposes of emphasis. You might have logon, a word, lege, he says, an apostle. It's very important, therefore, to keep an eye on the endings, because it's by looking at the endings that you figure out that apostolos is in the nominative and is therefore the subject of the sentence, and that logon is in the accusative and therefore is the direct object of the verb lege. So just keep that in mind. That's essential to your study of Greek, and we're going to find that, of course, is constantly an issue that comes before us. He notes that the movable nu may show up at the end of certain words. This is not by any means the only occasion, but the third person plural verb ending usi, as in blepusi, if it is preceding a word that begins with a vowel, will typically add the nu. And that's simply for ease of pronunciation. We in English do something like that when we say a ball, but an apple. We add the in there to make the word and the phrase an apple easier to say. It's exactly what the Greeks are doing. So just keep your eye open. You'll notice that movable nu shows up occasionally when it's preceding a word that starts with a vowel. All right, well, let's go ahead and take a look at the exercises. I'll do the first three of each set. So here we have the first of the exercises. This is the words adelphos, blepe, anthropon. Adelphos, I recognize, is the word brother. I notice here adelphos is in the nominative, and I also notice that because the word precedes another word without intervening mark of punctuation, that the accent there, which was an acute, became a grave. Remember that? So adelphos, a brother, blepe, third person singular, sees, anthropon, a man. Omicron nu is the accusative, it's a singular, so a brother sees a man. Be careful not to translate this, a brother sees the man, because we don't have the definite article here. And so all we can do is use the indefinite article a until we finally have that word given to us in a later chapter. Second, we have doulos, and I know, of course, this is the nominative singular. It's a slave, doulos. Accent is a circumflex on the penult, dictated by the rules of accent. A slave, graphe, writes, third person, singular, logos, words. That's the accusative, plural, direct object of the verb write. A slave writes words. And then finally, the third example that we'll go through, I'll leave the rest for your own exercises later, but apostoloi, apostles, plural, that's the nominative plural, didaskusen, notice the movable nu there, didaskusen, teach, third person plural, anthropon, singular, accusative, a man. Apostles teach a man. Does that make sense? It's really not too difficult, and I think you'll be able to work your way through. Do the exercises and, of course, compare them with the answer key, but let's take a look at the others that are composition exercises translating from English to Greek. And I notice that the first example that I have there is going to be a servant is writing a law. And if I'm going to translate that, then I notice first of all that servant, the word slave, would also fit here, is in the nominative. So we're going to say, let me pull this down so it's on the line. So we're going to say doulos, a servant, and now I want to say is writing, and I know that the word is writing is the word graphe, and so to write graphe, I'm going to say, and you notice the graphe is he writes. This is the third person singular. A slave is writing, and then a law is the word nomon, and so it's from the vocabulary. I know that it's accented on the penult, so we'll put an accent there. It's in the accusative, and so I'm going to put it in the accusative case, and thus we have a slave is writing a law. That would be the first of the illustrations from the composition. The second one I'll just do for you as well here, just to get you started. This is number 2. A son sees words. A son, I know, is huios, sees, and of course this word is blepe. He sees, a son sees, and the word words is the accusative plural, so it's going to be la goose. A son sees words. And so I think you'll agree that that's pretty straightforward. I hope you've been able to follow my discussion of this matter. My strong suggestion to you is that you don't cut corners. If you really want to learn this language, the best way to do it is take the time to work through each exercise. The exercises that you find in Machen, both translating from Greek to English, and also the exercises that translate from English to Greek. Pay special attention to the rules of accent. Don't cut corners. Make sure you get them down. I've provided to you the answer key so you can do the exercise and immediately look at the answer that I provided for you and make sure that you've done it correctly. And if you have, then go on to the next one. And once you really feel comfortable, if you do these and thoughtfully work your way through them, then you'll feel quite comfortable with Chapter 4 and you'll be ready to move on to Chapter 5. So until then, I will let you go, and we'll hope to see you again in Chapter 5 when we take up the first declension. And until then, God's richest blessings on your study of Greek.